End of September 1943. After 3 months of heavy fighting in the Ukraine since Operation Citadel at Kursk failed, Marshal von Manstein's German Army Group South retreated to the banks of the Dnieper River. Although many soldiers believed that they were finally going to have a respite, and the abundant flow of the Dnieper would give them good protection, they soon abandoned this hope. And it is that despite the insistence of Manstein and many of his subordinates that the river be fortified to establish an effective defensive line, the truth was that practically no work had been done on it. The reason for this had been in the first place the refusal of the German leader to establish defensive lines in the rear, because according to him, this would only lead to the hasty withdrawal of the troops that were on the other side of said fortifications. Secondly, because even wanting to do so, Germany did not have sufficient resources to build a defensive line along the Dnieper in Ukraine, over more than 900 kilometers, in just a few weeks. In addition, a large part of those resources is being used in the Atlantic Wall that was being reinforced at full speed. To deal with this situation on the Dnieper, Manstein had 4 heavily crushed armies, these being the following from north to south: the 4th Panzer Army, the 8th Army, the 1st Panzer Army, and the 6th Army. In total, among all these units there were some 328,000 German and 109,000 Romanian, Hungarian and a few volunteers from other countries who were in the Weeking division of the Waffen-SS. In any case, and to give us an idea of his reduced forces, among the 14 panzer divisions that were under his command, they did not add up to 200 tanks, while his infantry divisions were equivalent to a single regiment. By way of example, it should be noted that there were sectors of the front of more than 2 kilometers that were defended by just 65 men. In his favor we can only say that reinforcements began to be sent to him at full speed, although as we are going to see below, they were never enough to face what was coming his way. On the other hand, the Red Army had, and again from north to south, the 1st Ukrainian Front, the 2nd, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian Fronts. As the author Citino indicates, all these units had a total of 2,230,000 troops, with more than 2,000 tanks and 2,600 aircraft, compared to the 625 aircraft that the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet had in the area. Thus, as a consequence of this German weakness, the Soviets crossed the river in numerous places as soon as they reached it, and began to establish bridgeheads all along the Dnieper during October and November. The most important bridgeheads were established in the first place in Bucharin to the south of Kiev, which precipitated the fall of the city before the end of the year of 1944. Secondly, they also managed to settle in the vicinity of Cherkasy, which would be one of the starting points for the subsequent bagging of German troops in the sector. And finally, and a little more to the southeast following the course of the river, the Soviets established a large bridgehead between Kremenchuk and Kamiansk, which directly threatened the entire southern defensive curve that the Germans had in the Dnieper. Marshal Manstein's efforts during those months were to try to maneuver as best he could to reject each new bridgehead established by the Soviets, or at least prevent their expansion if he could not reject them. It was on this one of the occasions in which he said that the Red Army was like a hydra that after cutting off one head, others immediately arose. In mid-December, Manstein had been able to contain the Soviet advance in the western sector of Kiev, using a maneuver similar to the one he had used in Kharkov 9 months earlier. However, what concerned him most was the deep penetration that the Soviets had made into the Dnieper some 200 kilometers further south, which was expanding all the time. As we have indicated before, the units in the Dnieper salient were in great danger of being surrounded, and Manstein could do nothing but request a withdrawal towards the Bug River, or even to the Dniester. With this he intended to shorten the front and concentrate units with which to counterattack, since his current position was impossible to maintain. However, the times of the great maneuvers of the Wehrmacht had ended, and what was requested now was a strong defense of the terrain without the possibility of withdrawal. The Soviets were already very close to Romania and Bulgaria, and if they continued to get closer, the German leader knew that they would end up joining Stalin. By the end of the year, Army Group South had been greatly strengthened as it was the most critical sector on the entire front, and now numbered some 800,000 strong, including some 200,000 Allied soldiers. However, the actual fighting force on the Dnieper did not reach 500,000 in total, since part of those men were in the Crimea. So, they did not have many options to resist the huge onslaught that the Red Army had prepared for them, with more than 2 million troops. The first major offensive of this phase began on December 24 by General Vatutin's 1st Ukrainian Front, which attacked the 4th Panzer Army in the vicinity of Kiev. Manstein's reaction was to order a flank counterattack against Vatutin's army, but General Raus, who was the commander of the 4th Panzer Army, did not have enough troops for it. Thus, the Soviet advance continued, taking the city of Korosten on December 29 and Zhytomyr on December 31. Within days, the 1st Ukrainian Front managed to open a gap more than 200 kilometers wide, while the German forces in the sector were irretrievably succumbing. Manstein tried to send as many troops as possible to reinforce the 4th Panzer Army, having to draw them from the 1st Panzer Army that was further south. However, this measure was not very effective because the Soviets had another blow prepared right in the sector, which the German Marshal had just weakened. So on January 5, Ivan Konev's 2nd Ukrainian Front attacked in the direction of Kirovograd, taking the city a few days later, while advancing on the German rear. Just one day before this attack, Manstein had taken a plane to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, where he made several requests to the German leader. In the first place, Manstein asked to abandon the salient that had been formed in the Dnieper curve, to retreat to another more favorable position, in which we can understand that he was referring to the Bug line. Secondly, the Marshal also asked for the abandonment of Crimea, where the 17th Army of General Erwin Janek was located, whose battle for the peninsula would come 4 months later, as we recently analyzed on the channel. In any case, Crimea was isolated and therefore lost, so Manstein requested to withdraw the more than 200,000 troops that were there, to defend the new defensive line that he wanted to create practically already on the Romanian border. And finally, Manstein requested the appointment of a supreme commander for the Eastern Front, who would be able to effectively coordinate the defense of the entire front, without interference from the German leader. For this position, Manstein himself volunteered. After a lengthy discussion, Hitler ignored all of Manstein's requests, ordering him to return to his command post and resist without backing down. When Manstein returned to Ukraine again, the situation was much more chaotic than when he had left it a few days before. Basically, Konev's troops were advancing unstoppably after taking Kirovograd, and now they were threatening to encircle a large German contingent in the vicinity of Cherkasy. Thus, and given this opportunity, the Soviets began their attack both north and south of said position on January 17, and on the 24th they managed to close the pocket, trapping some 60,000 Germans in it. During the days in which the Soviets were closing the siege, General Hans Hube, commander of the 1st Panzer Army that was in that position, asked over and over again to be allowed to withdraw, but the request was rejected by the German leader, who insisted on resisting. Once the siege closed on this unit, Manstein made every effort to free these troops, and organized a rescue group with up to 5 armored divisions, including the elite division of the Waffen-SS Leibstandard. As a curiosity, it was during these days of January 1944 that the famous Michael Wittmann destroyed more enemy armored vehicles, in a very short space of time. This led him to be awarded the Knight's Cross on January 14. In any case, and although this rescue went well, the wear and tear on the Germans was total. 18,000 men ended up being captured, and the divisions that had participated in this rescue ended up practically in pieces. To give a piece of information, although the Leibstandard had returned to the southeastern front completely restored in November 1943 with almost 20,000 troops, by the end of February it barely had a little more than 1,000 men, for which reason it had to be sent to Belgium to recompose itself. With that said, let's get back to the fighting. With this problem resolved, what was of most concern now was the advance the Soviets were making west of Kiev in the direction of Lutsk, with which they were once again leaving the Germans in a very unfavorable situation on the Dnieper salient. Thus, throughout the month of February, Manstein had to withdraw as much as he could from this advanced sector that they still held on the river, and cut the front line a little on its southern flank. After this big blow that the Soviets had just given, there was a bit of calm on the front at the end of February, but again it was the calm before the storm. The Soviet High Command was preparing new offensives for the month of March, with two clear objectives of advance. The first consisted of attacking from the southwest of Kiev in the direction of the Carpathians, and the second consisted of another large attack from the Dnieper salient in the direction of Odessa. This series of operations began on March 5 when the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts attacked in the direction of the Carpathians, advancing unstoppably to the city of Chortkov, which they took on March 23. With this action, the Soviets divided Army Group South in two, practically cutting off its communications. This caused that a few days later the group was reconfigured into two, renamed Army Group North and South Ukraine. During this action, again the 1st Panzer Army, which was trying to prevent the army group from being cut off, was caught in the middle of the Soviet onslaught and was encircled to the east of Chortkov. However, he was able to fight until April 10, when General Hube managed to get out of the encirclement and connected with the newly named Army Group North Ukraine. There he was able, together with his old friend the 4th Panzer Army, to consolidate defensive positions east of the present city of Leopolis. Officially, this fragmentation of Army Group South was what on March 30, 1944 led to the dismissal of Marshal von Manstein, who did not hold any military post for the rest of the war. In any case, while this was happening to the east of the Carpathians, further south the situation was not much better. Following the attack by the 3rd Ukrainian Front in early March, the German 6th and 8th Army had been forced back to the Bug River despite Hitler's refusal. However, they could only hold out for a week on their shores, and again they were forced to withdraw to the west on March 28. Soviet attacks continued and by April 6, they reached the Dniester River after encircling Odessa. The city ended up falling 4 days later, while the Red Army troops began to enter the Romanian border. And as if that were not enough, and while this was taking place, on April 8 the 4th Ukrainian Front began its attack on the Crimea, taking the city of Sevastopol a month later. This is how, in approximately 4 months, the Red Army made its way through western Ukraine in an advance of about 400 kilometers, in which they gave one of the most powerful blows of the entire conflict. Despite the heavy casualties suffered, which are estimated at 1,100,000 troops, and more than 4,500 tanks, the Red Army managed to recompose itself and only 3 months later, would start the huge Operation Bagration. The Germans for their part suffered the loss of some 250,000 troops, as well as the weakening of the rest of their fronts both in France and in the Army Group Center itself, which in total had to send some 34 divisions to this sector in their attempt to reinforce it. So this had strong repercussions when in June both France and Belarusia came under attack, and in these positions the Germans were undermanned. And last but not least, this chaotic situation led to the total weakening of the alliance that Germany maintained with Romania, which ended up collapsing when in August 1944 the Soviets resumed their offensive in the area. Well, up to here this program, which, just like I told you in the one about Manstein's counteroffensive in Kharkov, I consider to have been one of the best I've been able to do, and this is also a subject that has been rarely covered. If you want to analyze how this offensive was, as well as the loss of Crimea itself, I leave both programs in the description. Thank you all for being part of this community, and especially the sponsors who make this possible. Subscribe and share this program if you liked it, and we'll see each other here as always, next Thursday and Sunday. See you soon.